Namaskar, hello everyone. Myself Deepak Gupta, logging on this platform of College Dekho Learn to undertake the topic capital gains, and this is the first part of the topic capital gains. So, as we have discussed in our earlier sessions on income tax, there are primarily five heads under which whatever income is earned by an SSC is to be taxed. And this capital gains head denotes one of the special heads as it includes primarily non-recurring income, though not necessarily, but they are primarily not non-recurring incomes. Why? Because this capital gains denotes any profit or loss which have arisen only due to the transfer of any capital asset by the assessee. So what we are saying that it can happen that any assessee has certain capital assets. So the first and foremost requirement under section 45 of the Income Tax Act 1961, which brings any income to be taxed under the head income from capital gains, is that there must always be a capital asset. Now, what is the capital asset that we are going to discuss shortly? But there must always be a capital asset. So, we have to discuss what is the capital asset. Now, not just you are having this asset, you are transferring its ownership to someone else. So, there must be a transfer of ownership. There must be a transfer of ownership of such capital asset. So what this transfer denotes, that what we are going to discuss. And once we are satisfied that there is a transfer of the capital asset, then we have to analyze that during which financial year such transfer has taken place. Because until we identify the financial year, we won't be able to decide this capital gains is to be taxed in which assessment year. So if our assessment year at the moment of discussion is say 2022 2023, so the relevant previous year, this has already been discussed in our earlier sessions, will be 21-22. That is a period starting from 1st April 2021 and just closing a month ago, that is 31st March 22. So this transfer must take place during this period. So because our concerned assessment year for this session is assessment year 22-23, therefore this transfer must happen during the previous year 21-22, and until and unless this transfer falls in this previous year, until and unless this transfer falls in this previous year, there will not be any capital gains taxable. And obviously, either there will be profit or there will be loss. How is that to be calculated? That we're going to discuss from such transfer. So basically, if these four parameters are fulfilled, then any resultant profit will be known as capital gains, or the resultant loss, if any, will be termed as capital loss. This capital gain will be subjected to income tax rates as discussed in the future courses, and if there is any capital loss, then such capital losses can be either set off during the same previous year or they may be carried forward for next assessment years. Now, how that is to be done? That is the exercise that we're going to complete in various sessions on capital gains. So, beginning with the first requirement, that there must always be a capital asset. So, simply speaking, there is nothing so much about this or any difficulty about understanding the capital asset. In layman's term, when you use the word capital asset, it denotes a kind of property, it denotes a kind of investment. So as a layman, what you understand by the word asset is or should be a basic capital asset. But there are few exceptions. That is, there are few items which in normal sense denotes capital a financial asset or capital or asset normally speaking, but they still are not deemed as capital asset. मैंने क्या बोला कि कुछ ऐसे नॉर्मली जिसे आप असट समझते हो अकाउंटिंग सेंस में वही सारे कैपिटल असेट हैं, बट इसमें कुछ कुछ एक्सेप्शंस हैं। तो प्राइमरीली 3 एक्सेप्शंस हैं। ये 3 एक्सेप्शन इसलिए हैं क्योंकि ये तीनों अकाउंटिंग सेंस में असेट हैं, बट तब भी इनको कैपिटल एसेट की डेफिनेशन में इंक्लूड नहीं किया गया है। इट मीन्स इन स्पाइट ऑफ बीइंग एन एसेट, they are not deemed as capital asset. It implies that any profit or loss resulting from the transfer of such 3 exceptions will not be taxed under the head capital gains. So, what are they? The first thing is the stock in trade. दैट इज वॉट एवर आइटम यू आर डीलिंग विद, जो आपके बिजनेस का स्टॉक है वो कभी भी कैपिटल एसेट काउंट नहीं होगा। एक परफेक्ट एग्जांपल है हाउस। आप और मैं एक नॉर्मल बंदे के लिए हाउस सबसे बड़ा कैपिटल एसेट है। तो अगर हम उसको बेचेंगे तो दैट शुड ऑलवेज बी प्रॉफिट और लॉस। नॉर्मली देयर इज प्रॉफिट and that will be taxed as capital gains. But for a builder, whatever flats or the houses he is making as a stock and he is doing it for resale. So though profit arising on such stock sale of even the flat should be deemed as income from business and profession, and hence stock and trades are excluded from the purview of the capital gains. Second aspect or second exception is personal effects or personal assets which are movable. यानी कि सिंपल भाषा में जो आपके मूवेबल पर्सनल असेट्स हैं, जैसे कि आपका अपना मोबाइल फ़ोन, ये आपका पर्सनल असेट है और ये मूवेबल है। नॉर्मली इन्हें एक्सक्लूड कर दिया गया है कैपिटल असेट डेफिनेशन में से, बिकॉज आइडियली they will not be sold at a profit until unless they are antique. They will not be sold at a profit, so there is no point to charge them to the capital gains chapter. But there is one word, that is jewelry. So jewelry is an exception of the exception. That is, in spite of being a movable personal asset, it has been excluded from the concept of personal movable asset, and hence it becomes a taxable capital asset. It means ज्वेलरी के अलावा किसी भी तरह के अगर आप अपने पर्सनल इफेक्ट को, अपनी पर्सनल कार को, पर्सनल मोबाइल को अगर आप बेचोगे, प्रॉफिट हो चाहे लॉस हो, उसकी कोई टैक्सेबिलिटी कैपिटल गेन्स में नहीं है। लेकिन अगर आपने ज्वेलरी बेची तो ज्वेलरी की टैक्सेबिलिटी कैपिटल गेन्स में होगी, बिकॉज ज्वेलरी विल बी डीम्ड एज a capital asset. And the third and important aspect is rural agricultural land. Our constitution does not allow any kind of taxation on agriculture. So whenever there is any profit, whether from the agricultural activities or whether from their transfer, there is any income arising to a farmer, it will be deemed as agricultural income and it cannot be taxed. And therefore, whenever there is a transfer of rural agricultural land, and if there is any recurring profit then or accruing profit, then it will not be taxed as capital gains, because effectively it is not taxable. So that is why rural agricultural land has been excluded from the purview of capital asset, and hence there will not be any capital gains on such transfers. So I shall summarize that there are any kind of asset, whether it is movable, whether it is immovable, whether it is tangible, whether it is intangible, they will all be deemed as capital asset, and hence any accruing profit or loss shall be deemed to be taxable under the head capital gains. But these three specifically, except the jewelry, won't be termed as capital asset, and there will not be any resulting capital gains or capital losses. So before I move forward, one of the examples of an intangible capital asset can be goodwill, can be patents, can be copyrights. So therefore, these are intangible capital asset, and hence if they are sold at a profit, that will be deemed as capital gains. So another important topic to be discussed before we move forward in the calculation of capital gains is this word transfer. So the transfer basically denotes change of ownership, and this change of ownership can be normally known as sale, but there are other certain ways where there is a change of ownership, and that should be deemed as transfer, and hence there will be a capital gains. For example, if there is a compulsory acquisition, Sometimes it happens that government, for the benefit of the nation, acquires certain properties, and that is why that becomes a compulsory acquisition, because sale is always with the mutual consent of the buyer and the seller. And this compulsory acquisition may not be acceptable to the seller, but still, for the benefit of the nation, government acquires it. For example, now in these development times where so many new airports are coming up or special economic zones are coming up, and there can be a cases that some of the agricultural land or some of the plots who are in between those proposed sites, they will be acquired compulsorily by the government, and that is why that also becomes a part of the transfer. And if that compensation given by the government to such owners, that will be their sale consideration, and that may result in any profits to such landowners, and that will be taxable as capital gains. So any kind of change by whatever matter should constitute transfer. For example, we have this word relinquishment. That is, due to certain reasons, you have undergone left your rights in a particular property. That is why you say that you have relinquished your title in favor of someone else. So in a way, for example, there are two owners and they are constituting co-ownership, and one of the co-owner, due to certain reasons, relinquishes his rights in the property for consideration received. Then that relinquishment effectively makes that co-ownership property into a proprietary ownership property, and hence there is a clear change of transfer to the extent of 50% of the ownership, and that is why that constitutes transfer, and hence that will be taxable as capital gains. So there are so many things which constitute transfer. What you should remember, that certain change of ownership, for example via will or via inheritance, so these two are clear examples where there is a clear change of ownership, but because it is a part and parcel of our normal life, they have been excluded from the definition of the transfer. It means they will not constitute the transfer of capital asset, and hence in these circumstances there will not be any capital gains. सिंपली स्पीकिंग, अगर मैं इस बात को अपने एक एग्जाम्पल से शो करूं, दैट देयर वाज मिस्टर एक्स हु वाज द फादर of a son Y. So on the death of the father, the property was inherited by the son. So there is a clear change of ownership from the father to the son, but because inheritance has been excluded from the purview of the transfer, that is why in that circumstance there is no capital gains. But now if son sells the property in favor of the buyer, then it constitutes a capital, or we should say transfer, and therefore there will be capital gains. So here there is an inheritance from father to son, and then the son sells the property to a certain buyer after acquiring the ownership from the dead father. Then in the first case it will not be transfer, there will not be any capital gain because it constitutes the case of inheritance. And in the second case it is a willful transfer, mutual agreed sale, which will constitute transfer, and hence there will be capital gains that will be calculated as discussed earlier. So we can always say that a person may acquire an asset, and when the asset has been acquired, he will use it for certain reasons of his own benefits, and then he will sell the asset. तो सिंपल भाषा में आपने असेट को परचेज किया और असेट को कुछ टाइम के बाद सेल कर दिया. हमने सेल को परव्यू को बड़ा कर कर उसे क्या ले लिया, ट्रांसफर. So similarly, in various modes as discussed above, transfer is a bigger term than sale. So we can say all sales are transfers, but all transfers are not sale. Similarly, this word purchase has been broadened to the word acquisition. On the same lines, equivalent to the word transfer, we will use the word acquisition, and we can say all purchases are acquisitions, but all acquisitions are not purchase, because purchase is a mutually agreed acquisition only. And this difference between the two will show the period of ownership. Now, this period of ownership defines that when we are having a capital asset, so based on this period of ownership, these capital assets can be classified either as long term assets or short term assets. And if we have long term asset, then the profit on the sale of such asset will be known as long term capital gain, or the loss will be long term capital loss. Whereas if the assets are short term, then the profits will be termed as either short term capital gains or short term capital loss. These short term capital gains are primarily normal income until unless specified, and this normal income will be subjected to normal slab rate tax. That is, the taxes will be as per the slab. That will be discussed in one of the sessions on calculation of tax. But this long term capital gain is a kind of special income which is chargeable at a special tax rate, at a special tax rate of 10%, at a special tax rate of 10%. So we actually don't have any capital gains word. We have the word either long term capital gain or the short term capital gain, depending upon that the asset sold is whether it is a long term asset or a short term asset, and that classification of long term and short term asset will depend upon the period of ownership, and that is the date of, or the difference between the period between the date of acquisition till the date of transfer. So this period of ownership can either be up to 24 months or it can be more than 24 months. So if the period of ownership is more than 24 months, then the assets are classified as long-term assets. And if the period of ownership is up to 12 months, then the assets will be deemed as short-term assets. And in case of short-term asset, we will have short-term capital gain. In the case of long-term assets, we will have long-term gain. And this period of 24 months is 12 months for financial assets such as equity, preference shares, and this is listed equity. For unlisted equity, it is originally 24 months. So only for listed equity, preference, mutual fund units, UTI units. So for all them, this period is trimmed to be 12 months. So if you sell them before 12 months, then their resultant profit will be short-term capital gain, chargeable to normal slab rates ideally. And in the case of ownership being more than 12 months, if it is a listed equity, then they will be deemed as long-term asset, and the resultant profits will be known as long-term capital gains, and they enjoy ideally lower tax rate. So before we move further, we have to remember that if the shares, that is the equity, even though short term, but they have been sold through a recognized stock exchange, they have been sold through a recognized stock exchange. And whenever there's a recognized stock exchange, we have a special tax levied known as STT, Securities Transaction Tax. So we can say that STT has been paid. Then in such cases, the resultant short-term capital gain will be deemed as a special income. So why it is a special income and how does it affect? We will discuss when we have another topics on taxation and deduction, and this special income will be taxed at the rate 15%, which is a special kind of tax. So long-term capital gains will always be taxed at the rate 10%, and in some cases, the taxes can be 20% also. Why the difference is that will be discussed in the sessions to come. But if there is a recognized stock exchange and the equity has been sold, even though within 1 year, then the taxability will be with at a special rate of 15% and not as per the slab rates. So we can see that we have to first identify that the asset sold is a capital asset, and it will be a capital asset if it is not a stock in trade, if it is not a movable personal asset, and it is not a rural agricultural land. And once we are done, we have to identify that there is a transfer, and after considering transfer, we also have to see the period of ownership, and based on that, the assets profit will either be long term capital gain or it will either be short term capital gain. Long term capital gain or short term capital gain. And once we have identified that it is a long term gain or the short term gain, then we have to identify that primarily there are three kind of costs that are associated with such transfer. Or we should say that as per section 48 of the Income Tax Act, whenever the asset is sold, there is a sale consideration which will constitute the revenue for the taxable purposes, or we should say for calculating the capital gains, the sale consideration will be deemed as the revenue, and out of this sale consideration, only three kind of deductions or the expenditures will be allowed. And if the sale consideration is more than these combined cost, three costs, then the profits will be there, known as either long-term gain or the short-term gain. And if there is vice versa case, that is the total of these three costs exceed the sale consideration, then there is no profit, but in fact there is a loss which will be termed as either a long-term loss or the short-term loss. So before we move further, we have to identify what are these three costs. So the first and foremost cost, obviously, that whenever you are making the transfer, there are certain expenditures to be incurred. For example, there can be charges of brokerage. Therefore, we have this word that all inherent expenditure incurred at the time of making the transfer will be deemed as cost of transfer. सो इफेक्टिवली वी कैन से कि अगर आपने प्रॉपर्टी बेची और आपको 20 लाख रुपए मिले, लेकिन 20,000 रुपये अगर आपने ब्रोकर को कमीशन दे दिया, तो इफेक्टिवली आपको 19,80,000 रिसीव हुए. सो वी कैन से दैट द सेल कंसिडरेशन इज 20 lakhs, and out of the expenditure of 20,000, that is the cost of transfer, the net sale consideration is only 19,80,000. The second cost must always be that because you are selling, it means you are obviously having the ownership of the asset, and the ownership must have come at the price. So whatever price have been incurred either by paying on to from the vendor from which you are buying, or any other expenditure which have been incurred by you at the time of acquiring the asset will be known as cost of acquisition. मतलब सिंपल भाषा में, अगर मैंने 20 लाख का मकान बेचा और 20 लाख के मकान को बेचने में 20,000 रुपये मेरे ट्रांसफर पे खर्च हुए, तो सिमिलरली अगर मैंने उस मकान को 10 साल पहले 4 लाख रुपए का लिया था और उस टाइम पे 5,000 रुपये मैंने ब्रोकर को कमीशन दिया था, तो 4,05,000 रुपये मेरा कॉस्ट ऑफ एक्विजिशन। और इसके अलावा अगर एक्विजिशन के टाइम पर हमने कोई स्टैम्प ड्यूटी पे करी, मान लो लेट्स से कि 10,000 रुपीज उस टाइम पर स्टैम्प ड्यूटी पे करी, तो आपने 4 लाख रुपए अपने वेंडर को दिए, 10,000 रुपये स्टैम्प ड्यूटी के खर्च करे, 5,000 रुपये आपने ब्रोकरेज दी, तो इफेक्टिवली your cost of acquisition will become approximately 4,15,000. And therefore, this is the expenditure at the time of acquisition. So this relates to the date of acquisition, and this is the expenditure which relates to the transfer. So this must relate to the date of transfer. But in addition to these two expenditures, there could have been certain additional expenditures incurred between these two dates, which have increased the value of the asset. तो जो भी खर्चा आपने एक्विजिशन और ट्रांसफर के बीच में किया और जिससे असेट की वैल्यू इंक्रीज हुई, एनहांस हुई, उसे नाम दिया गया कॉस्ट ऑफ इम्प्रूवमेंट. The word was cost of improvement. So ideally, this cost of improvement shall include only expenditures of capital character, that is, which have contributed to the enhancement of the value of the asset. If there are certain expenditures which are primarily of the repair character and they're just to maintain the asset in their normal position and they have not increased the value of the asset in any way, they will not be termed as cost of improvement, and such expenditures are not deducted to calculate capital gains. So these three are the exquisite cost that will be allowed from the sale consideration to arrive at the figure of the profits. And if these costs in total exceeds the sale consideration, then there will be resultant losses. The profit will be known as capital gains, either long term gain or the short term gain, and the losses will be termed as long term losses and the short term losses. So we will move forward from our next session onwards, where we will be focusing on the calculation of the capital gains, whether they are long term, short term, and that will be done in our coming session, capital gains 2. On this note, myself Deepak Gupta